really to answer what we heard earlier from the CNO, talking about a subject that is important. Welcome to what we're going to do is dynamic force employment posed as a question, are we ready to fight and win? Of course, his challenge this morning was, let's talk about what we're doing to make that happen, as opposed to a rhetorical question. And I think we've got exactly the right panel, exactly the right moderator to do that. And I appreciate you coming this afternoon and helping us not only understand what's the state of current state, but also ask questions and allow the panel to interact with you, the audience. A very important part of our program. Well, we are helped along the way in that process by, I think, a great moderator of this panel. Vice Admiral Mark Fox was the Corporate Vice President of Customer Affairs for the Huntington Ingalls Industries Newport News Shipbuilding Division. A distinguished career, graduating from the Naval Academy in 1978, variety of remarkable naval aviator positions as well as commands at sea. Everything from Carrier Strike Group 10 aboard USS Harry S. Truman, Carrier Air Wing 2 aboard USS Constellation, and Strike Fighter Squadron aboard USS Enterprise. Variety of other command and staff positions, ascending through the ranks in a way that was clear that he understood strategy, programs, and operations. A variety of jobs, including White House Military Office, as well as the Navy Office of Legislative Affairs, where I know he had the opportunity to explain the programs carefully. Admiral Fox, thank you for joining us today, and thank you as well for being here. Let's give our panel and our moderator a hand.
Thank you for your kind words, Bob, and thank you to AFCEA and the Naval Institute for hosting this venue. This is probably the finest professional gathering of its kind, I think, and I appreciate you all putting this together. I'm going to introduce our panel here, and after I've introduced them, I'll kind of give you a set piece to begin our discussion. To my immediate left is Vice Admiral John Alexander. I'm not going to read the entire biography, but he is a A6BN, an EA6B. He's had a robust career. I knew him personally as the commanding officer of USS Abraham Lincoln, operating in the 5th Fleet Area of Responsibility a few years ago. He's a Red Raider from Texas Tech, and on the personal side, he shared with me that he is a poor golfer and he is a slow reader, but he loves to do both. So please welcome Vice Admiral John Alexander. Next over is Rear Admiral Nathan Moore. He is the Deputy Commander, Pacific Area of the U.S. Coast Guard. We had originally had Vice Admiral Fagan scheduled to come, and she had a higher calling. The Commandant of the Coast Guard had a meeting in Washington, D.C., and she knows exactly who writes her fitness report, and she came back, and so she gave Admiral Moore this responsibility. The Pacific area of the U.S. Coast Guard goes from Montana to Madagascar, from the North Pole to the South Pole. He is a cutterman. He's a Coast Guard Academy graduate, and he was in command. He had command of Stratton, which is one of the new national security cutters. And he has unique experience. He's an engineer, and I was dismayed to see that there's a young man that's a flag officer that was commissioned after Desert Storm. Please welcome Admiral Moore. To the next left, to my left, your right, is Commanding General 1 MEF Marine Expeditionary Force, Lieutenant General Joseph Osterman, goes by Jody. He hails from the University of Colorado in Boulder. I noted in his biography that he's had numerous hardship tours, one of which was as the Chief of Staff at the NATO school in Oberammergau, Germany, where he was responsible for the training and support of over 54 nations. I know that was a difficult and challenging assignment. He takes therapy from Washington, D.C. VTCs by going down to the motor pool and putting on his overalls and taking a wrench and doing maintenance on his vehicles here. So I'm very pleased to have General Osterman here on our panel. Please welcome him. And then finally, we have Vice Admiral Tim T.J. White. He's the commander of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command in U.S. 10th Fleet. His granddad was a landing craft coxswain in World War II, and his dad was an Army draftee in the Cold War. Among his unique attributes, he is one of the few battleship sailors that's still actively serving. He was on board USS Missouri in the late 80s, early 90s. He is currently the commander of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command and 10th Fleet, but prior to that, he was the commander of National Mission Force in U.S. Cyber Command. Please welcome Vice Admiral Tim T.J. White. So this time 30 years ago was pretty much the peak of the Reagan buildup. We were almost at 600 ships in our Navy. The Cold War was still going, but later on in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. In 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait. We had Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then we went into a sustained posture in the Middle East at the same time that then in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. And so we suddenly found ourselves with a Cold War infrastructure and no peer competitor and new challenges in the Middle East. And so for the last 25 plus years now, we've had an enduring requirement in the Middle East to conduct operations. We evicted Saddam from Kuwait. We ultimately invaded Iraq. After 9/11, there was additional commitment into the Middle East. And so what we found ourselves is now, by the way, say that at the end of the Cold War, with that almost 600 ship Navy, we had a lot of fleet to go around. There were a lot of different places that the fleet could be at the same time. Today, we're at 280-something ships, and we've made a virtue of the necessity now of we want to be more agile, we want to be more flexible, and in fact, with Secretary Mattis's new national defense strategy, we're looking at near-peer competition and the ability now to be in many different, influence many different places with a smaller force. So our challenge today is with the dynamic force employment challenge, and that's the subject that we're going to talk about today. So what I would like to do is I'd like to kick it over to the panel with an opening question is what does dynamic force employment mean to you? And then we'll kick it from there. Sarge, over to you.
Okay, good morning. So we've got this term dynamic force employment, but I will tell you, in my opinion, the Navy is inherently dynamic. That's what we're built to do. We move, we go wherever we want. It's just a matter of how many assets we can put out there in any time. So, like Mark was saying, at the height of the Cold War, 1989, we had 578 ships and 600,000 sailors in the Navy. And then we rode those same Vietnam era, Cold War era stuff into Desert Storm. We took a 10-year hiatus, and then we built ourselves up for enduring freedom, Iraqi freedom, and then here we are again years after that, and we're now in the Cold War again, basically. Cold War is nothing more than great power competition. So we have a process for sustaining forces in this era. It's called the Optimized Fleet Response Plan, and what it does, that's nothing new. What it does is it actually provides you about 22 months of operational availability over a 36-month period. So it gives the strike group a time to do their maintenance, do their training, and then once they're certified to deploy, then we maintain that certification on them through a series of sustainment exercises over the 24 months. We hold them at a certain manning level, certain material level, and we train them systematically to keep them out there. So from a Navy perspective, dynamic force employment is just about moving ships and sailors around, and like I said, we inherently do that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. So for the Coast Guard, we're DHS, works for the Department of Homeland Security, and so to us, dynamic force employment is something that we would look at sort of in terms of flexibility, maybe is the best way to describe it. We have multi-mission assets, and we're small enough that we don't really have a garrison force. I mean, obviously, for the larger cutters that are deploying offshore, I mean, there is in-port maintenance and that sort of thing, but in general, when you go to a Coast Guard air station, when you go to a small boat station and a sector along the coast, those units are operating and training at the same time. And so to us, dynamic force employment means that we're basically operating as we train. That's kind of there's really no distinction or difference for us. We've done some new things in the past couple of years, especially out here in the Pacific. For the Pacific Area Command, we're looking in support of Indo-PACOM. We've done some different things in terms of deployments right now out to the Western Pacific, the Westpac, under 7th Fleet with our national security cutters. These are the new ships that we've got coming online. We've also been able to use some of our deployed forces and our training teams in unique ways, part of the access and authority that the Coast Guard provides. And maybe that's probably the best sort of soundbite for us that I can think of, is that the Coast Guard's value in terms of this discussion, in terms of force employment, our value is that we provide special access and authority. So we are a law enforcement agency, but we also can do Title X missions. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, under posse comitatus, the Department of Defense cannot do law enforcement, but the Coast Guard can under Title 14. And so we're able to sort of play both roles kind of neatly in between there and do things like put law enforcement detachment on 3rd Fleet ships and other places in the world. And so I think our role here is to be, because we're so small, we're a little bit unpredictable anyway, but with our flexibility with multi-mission and our ability to provide that special access and authority.
Thank you. General Osterman?
Okay, good afternoon. From a Marine Corps perspective, dynamic force employment actually really dovetails very well with our foundational doctrine and strategy. Whenever I talk to my folks about getting after dynamic force employment, getting after the near-peer fight that we're faced with, and as the National Defense Strategy directs us, it's really all about getting back to our Marine Corps doctrinal publication number 1, which is maneuver warfare and warfighting. And so for us, dynamic force employment really is kind of interesting, because when I look at it, I look at our near-peer adversary fight as being one where we're liable to run up against an enemy that has the capacity that we have, the capability that we have, and probably the lethality that we have. So really what it boils down to is our decisive edge is going to be in the decision-making process, the OODA loop, if you will, being able to act more quickly than the adversary when all other factors are equal. And so being able to get after that is really one of those things that's so important to us. Unpredictability in terms of dynamic force employment, things like that, that all goes into that OODA loop, if you will, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop that we have as part of our foundational aspect in terms of how we do business. Really important, because from our perspective, we believe that if you're going to be observed, you can be killed in this battle space, given the lethality of the weapons that are out there, and literally you can almost be observed anywhere. So being able to reduce those predictable factors that make it easy on the enemy are things that we need to get after and allow us to create time for ourselves and national decision makers about how we get after the threat and or the objectives that we might have out there. From a 1MEF perspective, that portends some things for me that we need to get after. One of those is sustained readiness. So I really have to maintain a ready-to-fight tonight posture. The Marine Corps has always been expeditionary in nature. You look back in the previous descriptors of the 911 force, being able to, as the nation needs us, be ready to go and act immediately. And so we really do have to live that and be ready for it, but in a much more broad context of capability, lethality, and capacity, as I mentioned. That portends having to do realistic training. So for example, I've got battalions out at 29 Palms right now that are working through more complex sets than what we've done before. Multi-domain battle space, and working the cyber, the electronic warfare, the intercept, essentially the near-peer capability sets that we'd have to face down the road. And along with that, for example, a big part of that is force on force. So instead of a scripted pre-deployment training program and, get ready to go to Iraq or Afghanistan again like we've done for 2 decades, how do we work against a thinking enemy and somebody that's that much more agile, if you will? And to that end, the 2 battalions that are out there right now are working against 45 commando, some Royal Marines. So the allies and partners aspect of this comes into play in a very large way as well. And then lastly is key to the dynamic force employment for us is the Navy Marine Corps integration. We are soldiers of the sea by definition. And so with that, being tied in closely with our Navy counterparts and relationships on the waterfront here, being able to dynamically move, be employed, and be employed in ways that are perhaps non-standard, such as going ashore, but not going ashore to prosecute a land campaign, going ashore to provide sea control as an additive capability or a complementary capability to the surface Navy, subsurface Navy efforts, et cetera. So that's something that we look at very much that way. And we're basically sticking to our traditional pieces in terms of scalable Marine Air Ground Task Force to get all that done. The good news for us in the dynamic force employment is that our doctrine is the same, our force capability generation is the same. It's just tweaking it to adjust to the threat in order to be able to get after the problem set. Thank you.
Admiral White.
Good afternoon. So maybe just a couple thoughts. And as sort of a functional commander, the thing that I have to do for all of my colleagues and their warfighting organizations to my right, whether it's 3rd Fleet or 7th Fleet, 1 MEF or 3 MEF, or for Coast Guard PAC area, is I'm in the business, hopefully now and in the future in the context of dynamic force employment, to provide them agility, flexibility, and lethality. So we connect the fleet. That's not all that we do, but that is sort of the foundational thing that we must always do. So I have to have 100% ACEBO. That is kind of the challenge that we have in cyberspace, which is increasingly akin to gray zone operations. It moves in very fast ways that are sometimes difficult to anticipate, and it's not necessarily coming at us the way threats in the past have come at us from state actors or things that look and move ponderously, perhaps, that state actors do. The thing that we need to do, I think, to credibly support these warfighters is for them to be dynamic. As we've heard them talk about, they need to maneuver, they need to be distributed, and they need to be able to aggregate and disaggregate on their terms. And for them to be able to do that, they have to be able to communicate. So they have to be connected. And a lot of that is also going to be the culture that we drive to each other as maritime services. So things like mission command, taking advantage of Marine Corps Pub 1 and those maneuver warfare principles, those are the things that we have to do all the time. You mentioned about allies and partners. We don't do this alone, and we don't do this in isolation, right? If we're going to be dynamic, you have to do it together. And the distinction in my mind between space and spectrum and cyberspace is becoming vanishingly thin. The farther we look into the future, we're going to have to be integrated. It's going to have to be seamless. The kit that we build and the operations that we design are going to have to be fully interoperable. And so there's a couple things that we're doing in the Navy to sort of enable that, and some of my colleagues in the audience can talk about these in much better depth than I can. Compile to connect, comply to connect. Those are some sort of foundational principles that we need to build a resilient and robust architecture. Things like compile to combat. Those are the way that we're going to manage going forward in real time, updating our capabilities afloat. So in the end, in the Navy's information warfare community, as point of the joint warfight, it's about bridging the gaps that still exist between mobile and non-mobile information warfare platforms and turning them into a single unitary whole. And as my joint boss would say, that is because we spend a lot of time thinking about great power competition. We prepare ourselves and generate readiness to fight tonight. but we are in the fight today mode in cyberspace. So in order to succeed there, we have to posture to defend forward, and we need to understand that it's about persistent engagement. It doesn't stop, it doesn't pause, it doesn't slow.
Thank you. Earlier today, there was a panel on readiness, and I don't want to replow necessarily the readiness piece, but that was the Title X perspective in many ways of the man, train, and equip piece. I'd like to get the perspective from the panelists on, we've been doing this dynamic force employment construct now for a little over a year. How has it worked for you? Are you seeing changes in readiness from an operator's perspective? What does the investment that the nation has made in readiness shown to you in terms of the last year, 18 months? I'll begin with you.
Okay, so I would argue the fact that we've been doing dynamic force employment for the entire time we're in the Navy. We called it that a year ago. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is we've seen our readiness bathtub start to drop, and we're on an incline right now. That was due to, in my opinion, 2 solid years of a budget to the military, and it's just like your home budget. You know, if you don't have a budget and all you're getting is money per quarter, you're not going to be as efficient, and you can't use your money in the right way. So having a budget for the last 2 years has allowed us to recapitalize a number of parts, COSAL, AVCAL, and start on a trajectory of increased readiness, I would say. But right now, we don't send anybody forward that is not fully certified with the full deal meal west of Hawaii. That's my guidance from my boss, Admiral Aquilino, and that's what we give him.
I'm going to put a caveat into the Coast Guard question because, of course, we just finished a continuing resolution, a government shutdown that impacted the Department of Homeland Security and the Coast Guard. So I'd add that piece to this part of the question of kind of how did that affect you and your Coast Guardsmen, and kind of this is a near real problem that you've just had to deal with.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the shutdown certainly was difficult for our folks and for their families. I mean, the community outpouring that we got here in San Diego and everywhere, really that I heard of was tremendous, and so that's very much appreciated. I think operationally, all of us here, if you're working in this arena and you understand how complex assets work, maintaining a system of aircraft and cutter boats and major C4IT systems and that kind of thing. When the drawdown in spare parts and the lack of contracting that happened during that month we were shut down really ate into our readiness, and it's going to take us some time to get back out of that as we restock shelves and get production lines going at our overhaul facilities and that kind of thing. But there's no question we'll be able to do it, and we're certainly tracking in that direction to get there. I was thinking in terms of the question of for us in the Coast Guard on how we what's changed for us in the last year or 18 months. What you see on the Pacific side, the Pacific area in particular, is that we've really shifted to more of a security-focused posture. And some of that has been based on world events, interactions with Indo-PACOM and PAC Fleet for us. You see it in the Coast Guard policy statements, kind of in the way that we're posturing ourselves here in the Pacific. The Coast Guard's really doing its best to sort of align within the national security strategy where it talks about collaborate where you can and compete where you must. I think the Coast Guard fits in there kind of neatly in certain things that we're doing, both under 7th Fleet in the Western Pacific, things we're doing with our icebreaker down to resupply McMurdo Station down at the South Pole. They just departed last week from finishing that mission up. We have our Arctic icebreakers that go up to the high latitudes on the north. And so the Coast Guard, I think, in the last 18 months, you see, we certainly have not walked away from search and rescue, and we won't ever do that. That is one of our foundational missions. But you'll see law enforcement and security beyond just the standard counter-narcotics mission is becoming much more of a focus for us. And I think that's what you see in the last year and a half. You'll see the Coast Guard sort of leaning into security more in terms of Oceania and some of the areas in the deeper Pacific.
General Osterman?
Okay, I think from a Marine Corps perspective, what we're seeing, in terms of the dynamic force employment and impact on readiness is really a couple of things. I mean, by definition, the dynamic force employment is designed to be more unpredictable than what we have in the past. So sometimes when we look at this near pure fight that we've been tasked with, or readiness for a fight, it isn't what it used to be. This isn't the Cold War all over again for us, because those were very deliberate workup processes and whatnot. So some of the things that we're seeing right now is, for example, with our manpower processes, how do we force generate in a way that the unit has the resources, especially the people, in place to be able to conduct training, to be ready to accomplish those mission essential tasks in somewhat of an unpredictable schedule. And that really is a little bit of a tough one, and one that we're working through, because I can't afford, for example, on the Marine Expeditionary units, I can't afford to force generate a Marine Expeditionary unit only to have it asynchronous from the shipping, the ARG, Amphibious Ready Group, that may be in a yard period or something like that. So it's one of those things where we have to work on all that together, coordinate closely to make it happen. To the point about the physical aspects and impacts over time, I think, just as was mentioned, Admiral Moore, about the continuing resolution, we've had some very good, we've actually gotten a budget, which has been good. But it takes more than 1 year to dig out from 10 years of CRs. The predictability of being able to have finances and whatnot in place. For me, a lot of it is secondary repairables. How do I get the parts on the shelf? How do I build that stockage that I need in order to be able to be ready to fight tonight? Because if I have to surge maintenance to surge capability, I've got to have that stuff ready and waiting. I mean, I'll find creative ways to get the manpower associated with it, but if I don't have the repair parts or anything else, surge isn't going to happen that way. We've also taken a lot heavier look at our operational concepts in terms of forward deployments and how do we pre-position forward, getting back to our maritime pre-position force operations to be able to draw from our pre-positioned stocks, whether it be up in Norway, whether it be the afloat stocks, et cetera. So those are some of the impacts that we've looked at as we get kind of back into some of those things that we haven't done for a while.
Thank you. And for Admiral White, I'd like to shift this just a little bit, because you're in the process of standing up computer network protection teams, and tell me how you're doing with that as well in terms of the resources that you've been given and the priorities now that you see coming as cyber continues to grow in importance.
Okay, so that's a good question, thanks. So part of my response is I don't know that I have all the answers for this. It's very dynamic, it moves very fast, and so our force by design has to be agile to pace that. So as part of the joint construct, my boss, General Nakasone, has talked about we are past the build phase in what's known as the Cyber Mission Force in the Department of Defense, and we are now missioning, purposing, and building readiness across that force. 133 teams, a little over 6,000 cadre, 3 types of mission elements there: protection, support, and then mission or combat teams. On the protection side, I think we've spent a little too much time, very careful about making any news here, a little too much time sort of responding and reacting to sort of the same problems that we've always had: breaches, penetrations, ambiguity, and uncertainty in our networks. What we need to do with those protection teams is we need to purpose them in a different way to be a combat-oriented maneuver element inside what I would call Blue Force networks. So there's a whole bunch of hunting principles and so on. It's a different mindset. And so taking that sort of historically system administrator function, purposing all that knowledge and talent into something that looks like a warfighting element. That's why our goal is to sort of integrate them increasingly, across the FMF, right? So how do we build high bars and build that common culture so that we too view ourselves and in fact function like a warfighting maneuver element? I think the answer there is going to be a couple manpower initiatives on those things that in the Navy anyway, looks like our information technologists. That's an extraordinarily professional force. They are amazing in everything that they do. It's the second largest manpower rating in the Navy. And what we need to do, in my judgment, is invite them to be exceptional as a local defender. And if I was to try to paint a picture about what is the most common ground here, I would say it goes back to our success in the Cold War in a great power competition, and in fact is the origins of 10th Fleet in the ASW fight. Right, we need to expect them to hunt and declare datum and then defend and pursue the enemy wherever they are found. And that is what we need to do. And so that talent base is really about upskilling and upgunning our training pipeline, recognizing that that is going to be a good foundation. It'll be necessary, but insufficient. So we will need to work with those in our partnership that very often are on the cutting edge, and that frankly is going to be many of you in the audience, which is industry. You are pacing and you are innovating and you are developing in ways that sometimes makes a conventional force anxious. And so we need to figure out how to bring down those barriers and solve some acquisition problems. So I think that's the way it works for us on the protection side.
Thank you. So Secretary Mattis, former Secretary Mattis, said he wanted this construct from the National Defense Strategy to be strategically predictable to our partners and operationally unpredictable to our adversaries. So probably to Admiral Alexander, how are we doing on that?
How are we doing on that? I think we're doing a lot better. We saw the Harry S. Truman Strike Group not deploy in the standard manner last year, so they did their OFRP cycle. They got in their window of employment. They went to sea for about 3 months. They came home for about 3 months. They went out again. You know, that's the tenets of force employment. We saw the Essex ARG, who was conducting a standard 6-month deployment, and she had already out-chopped 5th Fleet into the 7th Fleet AOR, and higher headquarters turned her around. They needed her in theater 30 more days. So, you know, the forces that we're moving forward are trained at a high level. They're manned and equipped where they need to be, and we can move them around however we like.
From a Coast Guard perspective, you've supported 7th Fleet. Can you describe some of the initiatives that the Coast Guard's been doing in terms of supporting this concept for Western Pacific?
Yeah, of course, I think what we see in the Coast Guard, and we see the way that we see it's working for us is that the demand for our services has never been greater. And we've been in high demand, but I think what you're seeing, especially in the Pacific theater, is that it's even a higher demand. I think many of these small countries, if you're looking at countries that we're developing relationships, that are developing their own naval capability, many of these developing countries' navies are really more like Coast Guards in terms of size and capability. And so we sort of are a natural link to them. We have, I think, to be frank, I think there is some advantage to us not being in the Department of Defense. We have there's a different type of access that we can get to some of these countries by bringing a Coast Guard cutter in or flying in a law enforcement team. That when a gray hull comes into a port, it signals a different kind of event, and that's obviously useful in some contexts, and sometimes it's useful for us to be there as the Coast Guard. So I think we see that sort of ability for us to coalition build at a small scale, especially as we look at the focus on the Pacific, Indo-PACOM's focus as we look at Oceania out to second and third island chain. The U.S. Coast Guard, I think, has a real role to play there in terms of our access and authority to those nations.
Thank you. From my experience, having been a deputy COCOM commander and a fleet commander and the consumer of the readiness that was generated, there's always been an insatiable COCOM demand of the readiness that the services produce. How are we doing now in terms of mitigating or managing that demand signal from the COCOMs vis-a-vis this new construct of, an old new construct of dynamic force employment? And this is really for you, Sarge, probably.
That's 2 in a row, man.
Hey, you're closest by.
So how are we doing? So I think we're managing it well. I think the COCOMs, before the Desert Storm, the COCOM shifted to the primary of CENTCOM. And it stayed in CENTCOM for about 2.5 decades. Because we rolled from Desert Storm, there was a period of break. We rolled right into Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom. So whatever CENTCOM wanted, they got, okay? Now, with the advent of great power competition, you're seeing a greater need for forces in the Western Pacific. You're seeing a greater need of our forces up in the high north, and moving those ships around in a dynamic effort keeps our adversaries off balance. They have to react to that. The primary example, when you take a strike group into the South China Sea, every ship gets a dance partner at that point. Everybody has a tag. So that imposes cost. I will tell you, I think we could probably leverage DFE a little better if we got more into artificial intelligence, machine learning. If we were able to take the OODA loop, you'll hear CNO say, hey, the OODA loop, everybody's observing and oriented at about the same pace due to the satellites overhead and all that kind of stuff. But you got to decide and act quicker than your adversary. I would argue that we need to get into machine learning in a big way and turn the OODA loop into a PODA loop. So I can predict, orient, and decide faster than my adversary, so I can employ my force in a more dynamic manner before he even knows what's going on.
I'd like to open this up, by the way, as we continue. If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone, and we'll begin taking some Q&A here from the audience. I'm going to continue to pepper them with questions until the audience starts to move forward. So if somebody's ready to move to the microphone, and I see we've got one.
Mark, if I could, while we're getting lined up for the microphone, just one example when we talk about the loading or the insatiable appetite of the COCOMs, it has not been mitigated at all.
Well, that's what I thought.
I mean, literally 2 months ago, 1st Marine Expeditionary Force located here at Camp Pendleton. In our force generation role, we also have a warfighting role. It was last month before, I had Marines in 5 different COCOMs. And so everything from MU deployments to special purpose MAGTFs and Central Command, to special purpose MAGTF in this case being about 2,000 Marines. And then had folks doing a unique dynamic force employment, in that it wasn't an existing, it was a new start for a dynamic force employment going down to South America. And then have folks here in NORTHCOM doing various missions to include the border mission. So it is still insatiable, and I think becoming even more dynamic, which from a force provider perspective makes it really interesting.
Sir.
Yeah, Rear Admiral retired Mike Mann. So I'm going to get to the question after the name of the panel, which is, are we ready to fight and win? We all know we fight as a joint force, and we have a well-oiled machine in CENTCOM right now that's delivering every single day. But that's not a near-peer competition. It's not a fight against the near-peer. So I fully understand the Navy's dynamic capabilities, but how are we doing integrating the Navy's dynamic capabilities into the rest of the joint force? And absent something like JIFCOM, which we used to have until 2011, who's gluing all that together and so that we're ready for that fight against a near-peer competitor?
I'll jump in. I guess to the first one, if we go at the macro level, the chairman of the Joint Staff and the Joint Staff see themselves as the global integrator. So from a COCOM perspective, in other words, it's not just one COCOM that would be fighting an adversary. We'd be hitting them in wherever they were. So when you think of any borders or Silken Road Initiative, et cetera. There's all kinds of pressure points that are out there that aren't resident in one particular COCOM. So you have the global integrator perspective. I guess from a Marine perspective, I think that's one of the strengths that we've come out of the last 2 decades with, obviously employed very heavily as a ground component, and therefore my Marines right now that are doing various missions around the world, they've already worked with the Army guy or gal that they're adjacent to. And so the relationships are incredibly tight. We already have very tight relationships, obviously, within our naval service, because that's who we are. But and then when it comes to the Air Force with the CFAC, the ability to coordinate ISR capabilities, strike aircraft, most Marines have no idea whether it's a Marine aircraft or an Air Force aircraft, whatever it might be coming in. They're comfortable with working all those at the tactical level. So it's, I think the purple aspect of our warfighting capability right now is actually pretty strong. My concern is maintaining it as we move out of the CENTCOM arena and some of the traditional Iraq, Afghan type fights we've been doing.
If I might just extend on that. So cyberspace doesn't distinguish between advanced persistent threats and other than Navy bits and Army bytes and Coast Guard algorithms in cyberspace. We all eat it, breathe it, drink it, consume it, plug into it all day, every day. There's very little, if anything, that distinguishes between the services and their networks. It's the same governing and overarching federal acquisition regulation that guides what we do. We used to benefit, perhaps, from establishing the requirement in the Department of Defense and then also designing the solution. I would say that was an attribute of the old Cold War in the way that we could be the big consumer and the largest check writer, and we could drive that. That is not an attribute of the current great power competition. We consume at the bitter end of the consumer market, period. And so it doesn't matter if you're in a foxhole or if you're on a Coast Guard cutter, if you're forward on a Marine FOB, or if you're on a strike group underway for Sarge, it is all the same. So we are fundamentally, inextricably joint, period. It's a single network. And we are getting increasingly good at knowing each other's ranks and our service histories and service culture across the force in cyberspace and spectrum.
Admiral Moore, I have a question for you. Jim Harkins, a former Marine, retired that is. Everyone so far has been talking about the blue water. Could you tell us a little bit about the Arctic and your icebreakers and how many you have coming online and what their longevity life is at this time? And I would appreciate something about that particular portion of the Coast Guard.
Sure, of course, absolutely. That's a great question. So, if the Coast Guard is right now, on track. Frankly, our major sort of acquisition campaign is really kind of a two-pronged thing. One is these medium endurance cutters that we're looking to replace that will do primarily counter-drug mission and medium sort of distance offshore work, and then the icebreakers. So the icebreaker is really a big part of our acquisition strategy and our focus going forward. So today we have Polar Star, which even though I'm not that old, I guess, I was an ensign on Polar Star back in the day, and this is true, when I showed up on Polar Star as an ensign, the chief that checked me in that day at the quarterdeck told me, well, this ship is really old and we're going to get rid of it. And that's when I was an ensign, and we're still talking about getting rid of Polar Star. They left McMurdo about 3 days ago to head north to come up to New Zealand and back home. So that is our one polar icebreaker that operates today. Our sister ship, Polar Sea, is laid up, and we strip her for parts in Seattle. Polar Sea hasn't run in years. It won't again. We have what we call a medium icebreaker, just in terms of the thickness of ice that the ship will break. That's the Coast Guard cutter Healy. It does Arctic work, just because the Antarctic would typically be thicker, fast ice that they maybe couldn't handle. So we have one that goes to the Arctic, and we have one that goes to the Antarctic today, and that's kind of where we're at. So recognizing that that is a huge shortcoming in our capability, especially compared to other Arctic nations, in particular the Russians, and if you look at obviously the Northern European countries, the Chinese have more icebreakers than we do at this point, and they're not even an Arctic nation. So we are in the throes of getting funding secured to replace Polar Star as a heavy icebreaker. What our commandant would say is that we want 6 icebreakers. That's what we think we need. 6 icebreakers. 3 of those should be heavies, and we need 1 now. And so that's kind of our 6-3-1. That's what I'm told to say.
So my follow-on question goes to Lieutenant General Osterman. Could you tell me what the dwell time is, please? What the current dwell time is between deployments and back in the CONUS?
The dwell time, in other words, the time that you have between deployments for the Marines here, actually we've been getting better. I mean, we were at less than 1 to 1, so historically, but we're striving to get back to a 3 to 1. Right now, I'm kind of holding it about a 2 to 1 on the average. So it depends on what the commodity, what kind of MOSs we're talking about, military occupation specialties. Our most stressed folks tend to be our enabling capabilities, to be honest with you. They're the ones that get hit the hardest. So our infantry units and all that are, getting, frankly, a little bit of respite because we've been activating reserve units in order to operationalize our Marine Corps Reserve to help with that. And they get great experience out of it as well, so it's a win-win for us all the way around. But that's about where we are, is about a 2 to 1 dwell right now.
Thank you very much.
Bob?
Yeah, Bob Wood with AFCEA. This is really focuses on the homeland as sanctuary. And as Admiral White mentioned, it's not, because cyber is ongoing. The cyber conflict continues. And when you think about dynamic force deployment, you have to think of tempo and the ability to sustain forward deployed forces. The Undersecretary talked about the industrial base and its limits. I just was participating in a great exercise down in Houston and looked at the port down there and throughput of forces as they were being cyber attacked. What are the concerns you have in the homeland as with regard to the sustaining and sustainment base and the ability to flow force and forces in order to sustain this tempo that really is the underpinning of what you're after?
So I'll take that a little bit. So if you look back in the late 80s, like you said, we had about 578, 580 ships. We have about 120 of them underway. Now we have about 285 ships, and we got about 100 of them underway. So we didn't quite figure that out. I think to be dynamically employed, we need a higher industrial base. I thought I saw, I may have this number wrong, but I looked on the internet the other day, and we're spending like 3.6% of our gross domestic product on the military. And I will tell you, when I was working at the Pentagon, Admiral Mullen, he was a 4% guy. He said nothing less than 4%. And I think that gets at the point. We need to be able to generate the forces on short notice here in the States. But that's becoming increasingly difficult with the advent of technology. If you recall in World War II, we were pumping a B-25 off the line every day and a Liberty ship out of Norfolk every week. We can't pump an F-35 off the line every day. We just, the technology, the amount of money, and do that. But we do, I think, need to have a stronger industrial base with regards to shipbuilding. Because a lot of our ship maintenance is what we see is we see growth work in the middle of that, and then the maintenance goes long, and then that has problems with the training period for the employment period. So I think there's some room for improvement there.
This man and then this man.
Hi, Sam LeGrone with USNI News. I was wondering how dynamic force employment allows y'all or gives y'all sort of permission as an institution to kind of mix and match and do some different things with assets. I'm specifically thinking about the Littoral Combat Group 1, where the Somerset and the Wayne E. Meyer were operating off of in the Eastern Pacific, off of Central and South America. Does the idea that doing things unpredictably give you some options for experimentation that maybe you didn't have before? Thank you.
So the Littoral Combat Group 1. So let me talk a little bit about LOCI, the Littoral Operations in a Contested Environment. It's a concept paper of how we're going to do business. And so there had been different terms used before, upgunned ESGs, all that kind of stuff. But the LOCI paper, concept paper, kind of tries to get at the heart of the command and control between the Marines and the Navy in an amphibious environment. So previously, it was pretty cut and dry. You had a CATIF and a cliff, you know, and it was a forcible entry operation, or it was, you know, the entire MU was employed almost directly. And then once the majority of the MU got ashore, the MU commander became the cliff, and he C2'd all his forces ashore. In a dynamic environment, I'm not sure we're going to be employing them all at once. We may employ them all at once, but in different areas. You see what I'm saying? So that command and control structure is going to end up being something different, and Jody and our team work on that. Pacific Blitz is coming up. We work on that. We did that last year in Dawn Blitz. We formulated a Littoral Combat Group 1 to go down with Somerset, and I forget the DDG that was with them, and a special purpose MAGTAV. I can form a Littoral Combat Group anytime I want with whatever forces we have to be. It doesn't have to be a full MU, doesn't have to be a full ARG. It can be whatever it is, and I put somebody in charge and send them on their way.
And I think, you know, from a Marine perspective, as Admiral Alexander mentioned, we're naturally, that's just how we do business, you know, as a MAGTAV construct. So mixing and matching, constantly ebbing and flowing. And you always saw that traditionally with some templated things like a MU or a MEB or something. You're seeing more and more special purpose MAGTAVs where I'm organizing forces along with the Navy shipping, the amphibious ready group, if you will, or the equivalent littoral combat capability, in order to be able to achieve specific tasks that are out there. So, you know, some of that may be completely engineering focused, you know, so it may not be it may be that I put one of my logistics group commanders against that, you know, as the operating commander. So it really does go a long way that way. And just briefly on the C2 aspect of it, for example, in the CATIF Cliff, you know, you put the amphibious force ashore, you transition to a land campaign, you transition command and control ashore to the cliff. It's all World War II doctrine and beyond. You know, I'm looking at things right now where maybe the force I put ashore, as talked about earlier, maybe it's maybe it's one of my artillery type units that has a you know, it's a missile, anti-ship missile capability that now that command and control doesn't transition ashore. It's actually plugged into the composite warfare commander, you know, in terms of getting things done. So anyway, it's that kind of more graduate level work, I think, that we're very comfortable with, frankly, right now. And it's, I think that's, again, part of that dynamic force definition. It's not only temporal, but it's also in the capability sets that we present, you know, from an unexpected or maybe a traditionally non-standard way.
Admiral Mackey?
Dick Mackey, old naval aviator. I have a very simple question, but I've also heard a couple of things that really impressed me. Admiral Harris's fight tonight, Admiral Swift's unscripted exercises, and even better, I heard him from a Marine, so I'm impressed. Admiral Swift also recognizing the op-tempo problems that 7th Fleet had was sending 3rd Fleet ships over to support 7th Fleet. Is that still occurring?
So that was the 3rd Fleet Forward concept that was devised by Admiral Swift. So he tasked Nora Tyson to implement that when she was 3rd Fleet commander before me. So the first Pacific SAG started in, I think, 15. I was CTF 70. They came out west. Since that time, there had been 2 Strike Group 1 Vinson deployments under the 3rd Fleet Forward concept. And so when Admiral Aquilino turned over from Admiral Swift, he wanted to take the next step. So commanding forces across the date line of the 7th Fleet AOR back in San Diego was not where we wanted to be. He wanted to be in an expeditionary maritime operations center role. So CNO, in his Design 2.0, has come out and directed that Second Fleet and Third Fleet develop an expeditionary capability. So that's really the follow-on of Third Fleet forward. If we go forward, we will get a chunk of water. We will see two forces either ashore in an austere environment, in an ally, friends, or partners command cell, or like right now, we're working on putting a C5I adaptive force package together to see what we can do aboard an LPD this summer.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kuljinder Chima from PMW 150. The Air Force and the Army have heavily stacked investments in multi-domain operations, but the Navy hasn't signed off on it. What are your thoughts on that?
We executed multi-domain operations this last summer at RIMPAC. We had an Army task force, multi-domain task force, launch naval strike missiles at a ship in the Pacific Missile Range facility, and we also had Air Force B-1 that was going to drop on El Razam. There were some telemetry problems. They obviously didn't drop, but we continue to operate those and try to exercise multi-domain task force as often as we can. And in that same exercise, the Marines did a landing up on the eastern side up there near Kaneohe Bay. So, you know, operating in a multi-domain task force and a multi-coalition task force, I think we try to do that, because dynamic force employment is not only about dynamically employing your force, but being able to have other forces dynamically employ with you. Because you will see, we've never done anything without allies, friends, and partners. And Tim Keating at the International Sea Power Symposium made a great point. He says, no country is so big that they can go it alone, and no country is so small that they can't contribute. So we need to continue to work through multi-domain task force, incorporate our allies, partners, and friends, and try to develop a sense of what we can bring them along to do and what they can do for us.
Sir.
Dave Hart, Deloitte. This is probably more for Admiral White, and it kind of is inspired by the discussion of the age-old posse comitatus, which pretty much separates out what the Coast Guard can do in the vis-a-vis the other services. And you operate in a domain that's a little bit fuzzier with regard to exactly whom you've got to address on a day-by-day basis. Can you talk a little bit about rules of engagement and how they're evolving to allow you to operate in a domain that's significantly different than what we see with the other gentlemen?
So that's a really good question, and always very cautious about talking about ROE, too publicly. But I would let you know that there's an increasing confidence that we always have to be able to defend ourselves and represent our interests wherever they may be and however we may find them. I think that one of the things that underpins the ROE would be sort of policy considerations, and then also sort of common understanding and appreciation of the environment. I think policy is now sort of catching up, which is a good thing, and I think that we are improving confidence in what the force can do and should do, and that there's an increasing expectation that the Department of Defense, in my mind, needs to not only be able and ready to defend itself, but also consistent with having a combatant command organized under DoD with the right authorities, support across the interagency and government. I think that that's a pretty well understood process with defense support to civil authority and so on, and there are structures that are in place to enable that to happen. It was referenced here about an exercise down in the Port of Houston, probably Jack Voltaic, I think, is what that was. That's exactly the sort of enterprise effort that is happening across industry, local, state, and federal government authorities to understand what the maneuver dimensions are, how fast things can cascade together, likely in ways that we don't always anticipate. So I think it's probably not exactly where we need it to be, but it's a hell of a lot better than it has been in the past, in my observation.
Hi, Mark Pomerleau with Fifth Domain. General Osterman, as the Marine Corps is looking to stand up these MEF information groups, I'd be curious in your perspective as a commander, what those forces afford to you, where the Marines are with standing those up right now, and any types of exercises or events that are being leveraged to prove those concepts and force employments out.
Sure, glad to talk about it. The Marine Information Warfare Groups came about with the Marine Corps' last essentially reorganization to accommodate essentially the non-kinetic battle space. And to the question about multi-domain fight, we've been doing it for a while, and we recognized it a while back and are fully engaged in that. Right now, their status is that the manning is coming along, and it covers a bunch of different military occupational specialties, so we're seeing it fielded now. In terms of exercising it, I've got an exercise coming up, Pacific Blitz, that will actually have it fully integrated into being used during that, at least within the capability that's resident there already, in terms of manning of resources. To help us out with that, we're actually bringing in folks from, for example, the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, who have the conceptual basis and things like that. We're also bringing in other naval aspects that can tie in together with it. But really the idea here is that we've traditionally done kinetic fires very well, fire support coordination, et cetera. With the MiG, what I really want to be able to get after, it truly is the multi-domain fight. In other words, what are the information battle space things we've got to deal with? What are the cyber things? What are the electronic warfare things? What are all of these, in particular, non-kinetic attributes? And then how do I fold them into a combined arms fight? Because again, it gets a little more complex. I could very well, and using the traditional 5-phase warfighting thing, I might very well be in a phase 3, fully engaged, fully blown cyber fight against my enemy, but in a phase 0 physical fight. Mm-hmm. And so, that's one of those things, and I will tell you, it's going on right now, every day in the Marine Corps. In terms of trying to get different places. I fully expect to see that real world as I do my exercise. So anyway, with that, I think that's the, when we talk about the MiG, that's what it brings to us, and it really does get after that multi-domain, gets tied into not only the multinational aspect of our allies, but it also gets tied into the wider DoD aspect, because literally in that space, tactical actions have strategic consequences. And so we've got to be able to be conversant in that space, not only for warfighting, but then making sure that we're after our national objectives.
I'm going to ask the panel a final question here. There's also opportunity if someone else wants to join in, but it's a combination question, actually, and that is, with the advent of social media and the proliferation of tweets and unconventional ways of communicating, what's the OPSEC piece of dynamic force employment in terms of ships coming and going? And then the second piece of that is, how are the families handling the uncertainty of knowing when the ships are coming or when they're going?
So if we were actually going to, if I was going to actually try to get a carrier strike group out of here without a lot of fanfare, I'd shut the social media off completely. That's just really the case. We've sent carrier strike groups out to sea without making a fanfare, without telling anybody, and we get, media calling 3 days later going, why didn't you tell us? Well, that's part of dynamic force employment. We're not going to tell you. So it is going to be harder on the families. I think, when I first deployed in 1985, all we had was letters. I made 2 calls home, and the wife sent me letters, and they were all numbered, okay? So, when I left, I had my sea bag packed, and when she had a good time kind of when I was coming back, but it was not guaranteed. So I think the families are going to have to understand this is not a stagnant employment scenario where we go to the Arabian Gulf for 6 months. Everybody knows it's 6 months. Come home. It's going to be it's going to cause a lot more stress to the families, I think.
I think numbered envelopes is really good packetized communications. Look, social media, we've had a lot in the news with recent events about what any number of state actors are trying to do, leveraging social media to influence and have strategic effects and consequences inside nations that would generally characterize themselves as open, liberal Western democracies, right? We pride ourselves on the free flow of information, and in fact, it's written into our Constitution. And there are vulnerabilities attendant to that. So we are very, very good at taking advantage of convenience and the way that we can get plugged in, jacked in, and stay connected to everybody that we want and choose to connect to. It probably, from sort of an OPSEC posture, makes it a little too easy for us to understand how easy it is for everyone else to observe what we say and about what we say and what we're doing. The line between our professional lives and our personal lives gets kind of blurry, as an earlier comment talked about. And so I think the way that we have to approach this is sort of kind of like education and training, and sort of loose lips sink ships approach. And it is all too easy to observe what everyone else is talking about. And so we need to manage that. I very much appreciate Sarge's point about, why we feel like we want to lock down, lock up, and lock out. But we have to fit into a civil society in a way, but we also need to partner with civil society to protect the nation's national security enterprise and capability.
Yeah, and I don't think it's so much social media, frankly, because I go at it with we always strive to minimize, whether it be social media or anything else. But to be honest with you, everybody out there has a cell phone, everywhere in the world. And so, I go back to my premise that if you can be sensed, you can be killed. Well, they're going to sense you, okay? Even if you're not on social media, that one errant cell phone that was left on, is enough. And so, with that, I think part of our warfighting doctrine has to go, or TTPs, not so much associated with trying to be invisible, but to literally hide in plain sight, or to not present the enemy a discernible target to go after. In other words, 1,000 points of light. And that's kind of how I approach warfighting from the MEF perspective, is whether it be through deception operations, distributed operations, however you want to go after it, that it's a wide enough target set that the enemy really has no idea how to, number one, where do I target? And even more importantly, how do I weaponeer it? Is there that gold nugget I'm willing to put a hypersonic missile against? Or is it just yet another blip on the screen? So anyway, I think that's one of the things that we have to embrace. I kind of, for those that don't know, my last couple of jobs were associated with SOCOM. And so, what I described it as was modern camouflage. How do you get into a modern camouflage kind of environment and go after it? One way is to hide in plain sight. Another way, is certain masking capabilities or deception capabilities, et cetera. But that's, I guess, where I would come at it. I just don't think one MEF has 52,000 Marines. It never ceases to amaze me how creative they can be. And consequently, I have no illusions about being able to completely control them in a combat environment, especially when it comes to signature management. So it's just something I take as a minimizing rather than a stoppage.
Well said.
My question goes back to Vice Admiral Alexander. The anomalies out in the Western Pacific last year, 2 years ago, the Fitzgerald, the McCain. Can you talk to us a little bit about cross-decking?
About cross-decking?
Correct. Has that been terminated? Is that still in effect?
It has not been terminated. It has been reduced. Okay, so what he's talking about, there were a number of sailors that were cross-decked to the other ships that were not probably trained to the standard that they were based on that steering system, that sort of thing. But right now, you get to the point, we're still on a downward slide of manpower, okay? We're expected to hit nadir in the bottom in late 19, and we'll be coming back up. So the distributable inventory of sailors makes it difficult for Navy Personnel Command to man everybody at the 92, 95 piece. Now, if we cross deck or uphold or shift a set of orders for a sailor, that's done by the type commander, and that is briefed to the fleet commander.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for participating in this panel. I'd also like to thank our panelists here, if you can give them a warm round of applause.
I'd like to thank our moderator as well. Thank you for putting together a great conversation about some tough challenges, and we've got some great leaders that are taking it on, taking it aboard. USNI and AFCEA, thank you for being here at this panel today. On behalf of both USNI and AFCEA, I have a gift here, a book that's written, Fleet Tactics and Naval Operations. There's probably a footnote for all of you in here on that. That'll be presented to you, and there's an AFCEA bookmark inside. I'll give it to you as we leave the stage. I just want to tell the audience thanks again for being here today, and thank General Dynamics for sponsoring this panel in this panel space. We appreciate that support from them. And I hope to see you at the reception, which is about ready to happen just outside here next. Before you leave the reception, if you have a chance, drop a note on the app, as we have a survey instrument on there, and we definitely are a learning organization and take your comments extremely seriously, making sure you have value in this event. We'll see you back here in the morning for the morning keynote tomorrow, where Mr. Alan Schaefer, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, he'll be talking with us tomorrow. We'll see you then, and we'll see you in the hall here shortly. Give him another hand. Thank you very much.